I was hired through the dark web to monitor stable anomalies at a secret government facility. One of them just moved. Alright, before I start, I just want to say that if this post disappears, you'll know why. I've done my best to cover my tracks, but something tells me it might not be enough. And honestly, I don't know how much longer I have here. I don't know if this is safe, but I need to get this out there. Someone has to know what's going on. About 3 months ago, I was scrolling through some deep web forums. It's not something I'd normally do, but I was desperate. My bills were piling up. I'd lost my job, and I was in danger of getting kicked out of my apartment. I figured maybe I could find some work, any work, to hold me over for a while. That's when I saw the post. It was buried in a thread of odd jobs on a forum that, looking back, probably wasn't even remotely legal. The listing was vague. No company name, no contact information, just a single sentence. Looking for overnight monitoring staff, high pay, no experience needed. There was a link at the bottom. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The page that opened looked like a job application form, but the questions were weird. Not just the standard name and date of birth stuff. It asked if I had a clean criminal record. I did. If I was willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement, I was. And if I'd be comfortable working alone in unpredictable circumstances. That last one should have been a red flag. But desperate times, right? I filled it out and hit submit, thinking it'd probably lead to nothing. Less than an hour later, I got an email. No subject line, no sender address, just a single word in the body of the email. Accepted. I remember staring at the screen, trying to process it. I didn't even remember putting in my email address. The message had a phone number attached with a single instruction. Call this number for further details. I hesitated, but in the end, curiosity got the better of me. I dialed the number, and after a few rings, someone picked up. A man's voice, low and calm, almost mechanical. He didn't introduce himself, didn't ask for my name. He just started giving instructions. Arrive at the address I'm about to text you by 11:45 p.m. tonight. Bring only your phone and wear comfortable clothing. You will be paid $2,000 for each night you complete the job. Do you understand? I was stunned. $2,000 a night? I almost laughed out loud, thinking it was a scam. But the man on the phone sounded dead serious. I mumbled something that sounded like, "Yeah, I understand." And before I could ask anything, he hung up. A second later, my phone buzzed with a text. It was an address, way out on the outskirts of town. I'd never even been in that area before, but that night, I got in my car and drove there. The entire ride over, I kept wondering if I'd just fallen for some elaborate joke, but at the same time, I was too curious and desperate to turn back. When I finally got there, I almost turned around and left. The place looked like something out of a horror movie. A nondescript, gray building with no signs, surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. There was one guard at the gate, standing there like he'd been expecting me. He didn't say a word, just gestured for me to go inside. I followed his instructions, walking down a long, empty corridor that led to an elevator. The doors slid open as I approached, and as I stepped inside, I noticed there were no buttons, no floor numbers, nothing. The doors shut behind me, and I felt a jolt as the elevator started descending. When the doors finally opened, I was in a brightly lit hallway. A man in a white lab coat stood there, waiting. He introduced himself as Dr. Wren, tall, thin, with a calm smile that didn't reach his eyes. He handed me a clipboard with a non-disclosure agreement and motioned for me to sign. I didn't really have a choice, so I scribbled my name at the bottom. After that, Doctor, Ren led me to the room where I'd be working. It was small, with a single desk and a large monitor on the wall, divided into various camera feeds. Most of the footage was of empty, windowless rooms, some brightly lit, others completely dark. I couldn't tell what the rooms were for, or even if there was anything in them. Just empty spaces with an eerie, sterile feeling to them. "This is where you'll be working," Dr. Wren said, gesturing to the monitor. "Your job is simple. Watch the feeds, report any abnormalities, and do not leave this room until your shift is over." "Abnormalities?" I asked, trying to hide the nervous tremor in my voice. Dr. Wren smiled that same empty smile. "Unusual movements, changes in the environment, but don't worry, they're stable. Just keep an eye on them." "They're stable?" I repeated, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. Dr. Wren didn't answer. He just looked at me with that unreadable expression, then turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat down at the desk, feeling my heartbeat thundering in my chest. This was definitely not what I'd expected. But $2,000 for a night of monitoring? It almost felt too good to be true. I settled in, trying to relax. The clock on the wall showed midnight, and I figured I just had to keep my eyes open until 8 a.m. Easy enough, right? At first, nothing happened. The feeds stayed static, each room looking as empty and lifeless as the next. A few hours passed, and I was already bored out of my mind. I'd been staring at the same dozen empty rooms for what felt like forever. But then, around 3 a.m., I noticed something odd. One of the feeds flickered, the screen going black for a split second before coming back. It was one of the rooms that had been completely dark. So at first I thought it was just a glitch. But as I watched, I realized there was something in the room. A shape, a figure, almost like a shadow standing in the far corner. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen, trying to make out what it was. The figure was barely visible, just a faint outline against the darkness. But it was there. I was sure of it. I reached for the phone on the desk, the one Dr. Wren had told me to use in case of abnormalities, and dialed the extension he'd given me. After a few rings, he picked up. "Yes?" he asked, his tone as calm as ever. There's something in room 7, I said, feeling a little foolish for calling it in. "It looks like a shadow or something." Dr. Wren didn't respond right away, but I thought I heard a faint whispering in the background, like someone else was on the line. After a few seconds, he replied, "Just observe it. Report any changes. Do not, under any circumstances, leave the room." Before I could ask anything else, he hung up. I sat there, staring at the monitor, feeling a prickling sensation crawl up the back of my neck. I watched the figure, half expecting it to disappear, but it didn't. It just stood there, motionless, as if it was aware that I was watching. And then, just as I was about to look away, it moved. It was subtle, just a shift, like it was turning to face me. The shadow was still mostly indistinct, just a darker shape in the corner, but I could feel it staring back, almost like it was looking straight through the screen. I sat there, frozen, unable to tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware, that it knew I was watching, that it was waiting for something. The longer I stared, the heavier the air felt, like something was pressing down on me, filling the room with a cold, suffocating presence. I glanced at the clock. It was only 3:15 a.m. I kept staring at that shadow in room 7, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. It was strange. I couldn't see any details, just a faint outline, but I could feel it watching me. Every instinct was screaming at me to look away, to call Dr. Wren again, but something kept me locked in place, like I was caught in a trance. The clock on the wall ticked on, each second feeling like an eternity. I must have spent 10, maybe 15 minutes just staring at that screen, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow started moving again. This time, it was more deliberate. The figure seemed to glide, slipping across the floor with this eerie, fluid motion, almost like it was floating. It moved from the corner of the room to the center, and as it did, I noticed something even stranger. The lights in the other feeds started flickering, one by one. Rooms that had been brightly lit just moments ago were plunging into darkness, as if whatever was in room 7 was spreading, like a dark stain creeping across the screen. My hand went to the phone, fingers shaking, but I didn't pick it up. Dr. Wren's instructions echoed in my head. Just observe it. Report any changes. Do not, under any circumstances, leave the room. So I sat there, watching, feeling my palms grow clammy. On the screen, the figure was now in the center of the room, standing perfectly still. I strained to see if I could make out any features, anything that might give me an idea of what it was, but it was just a dark silhouette, a shape without form. Then, something else caught my attention. In one of the other feeds, a room I hadn't noticed before, I saw another figure. At first, I thought it was a glitch, some kind of shadow cast from room 7. But as I looked closer, I realized it was something different. This figure was much clearer, with defined edges and a distinct outline. It looked like a person, but there was something off about the posture, like it was hunched over, its limbs at odd angles. I didn't know if I should report it. This new figure was in room 2, a completely separate feed, and I had no idea if it was connected to the one in room 7. But as I watched, I saw it turn, almost like it was sniffing the air, and then it moved towards the camera, one halting step at a time. I could feel my breath catching as it got closer, the distorted image slowly filling the screen, until its face, or what I thought was its face, was inches from the lens. There were no features, no eyes or mouth, just a blank surface where a face should have been, smooth and pale, like someone had erased its identity. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it knew exactly who I was, that it could see me just as clearly as I could see it. I swallowed hard, feeling the tension tighten in my chest, and that's when I noticed the whispering. It started softly, barely more than a breath, but it grew louder, filling the room with a low, murmuring sound. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was insistent, urgent, like a warning. I looked around, trying to find the source, but the room was empty, silent, except for the soft hum of the monitors. Then I realized the whispering wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from the monitor. The figure in room 2 was speaking, its blank face pressed close to the camera, and the whispers grew louder, filling my head, twisting into a static that made my skin crawl. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, every instinct telling me to turn it off, to shut it out, but I couldn't look away. Suddenly, the door behind me clicked, breaking the spell. I spun around, heart racing, half expecting to see Dr. Wren or one of the guards, but the hallway was empty. The door had closed by itself, but the lock hadn't engaged. It was as if something, or someone, wanted me to know that the door was unlocked, that I could leave if I wanted to. I don't know what made me do it, but I got up, taking a hesitant step toward the door. The whispers were still there, buzzing in the background, but something else caught my attention. An odd sensation, a strange pull coming from down the hall, just outside the room. I pushed the door open, peering out into the empty corridor. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Everything felt wrong, like I was standing in a place that wasn't meant for people to see. I stepped into the hallway, glancing back at the monitors one last time. The figures in room 7 and room 2 were gone, but the screens were still dark, the shadows lingering in the empty spaces, like a stain that couldn't be washed away. I walked slowly down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't know where I was going, or why I felt compelled to leave the safety of the monitoring room, but something was guiding me, pulling me deeper into the building. The whispers grew louder, like a chorus, filling my mind with a static that made it hard to think. I could feel my pulse racing, my skin tingling with a strange, electric sensation, and as I rounded the corner, I saw a door at the end of the hall. It was unmarked, just a simple metal door, but I knew that whatever I was looking for was behind it. I reached for the handle, hesitating. Every instinct told me to turn back, to go back to the monitoring room and wait out the rest of my shift. But something inside me, curiosity, maybe, or desperation, pushed me forward. The door opened with a low creak, revealing a darkened room bathed in a dim, reddish light. The air was heavy, thick with a metallic scent that made me gag. The walls were lined with rows of glass chambers, each one filled with a dark, viscous liquid, and as I stepped inside, I saw movement within the tanks. Figures suspended in the liquid, their limbs twisted and contorted, their faces blank and smooth like the one in room 2. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me, and I took a step back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The whispers were louder now, filling the room, and I realized that the sound was coming from the figures in the tanks, their mouths moving in a silent, synchronized chant. And then, as if sensing my presence, they all turned their heads, their blank faces pressing against the glass, staring at me with empty eyes. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I had to get out, had to leave before a loud alarm blared, echoing through the building, and the lights flickered, casting the room in harsh shadows. I turned and bolted down the hallway, heart pounding, the whispers chasing me, growing louder, more desperate. I could feel something behind me, something cold and dark, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the monitoring room, I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The monitors were still dark, the feeds cut off, but I didn't care. I just wanted to make it through the night, to survive until morning. I sat there in silence, listening to the echoes of the whispers, feeling the cold weight of their gaze pressing down on me. The clock on the wall showed 4 a.m., and I realized I still had 4 hours left. Back in the monitoring room, I felt like I was suffocating. The silence in the room was thick, oppressive, as if something was waiting just beyond the door. I kept glancing at the monitors, hoping for some sense of normalcy, but all the feeds were still dark. Even though I couldn't see anything, I felt their presence, those figures in the tanks, their blank faces and hollow eyes, pressing in on me from every direction. I forced myself to focus on the clock. It was barely past 4 a.m., and I had no idea how I was going to make it through the rest of my shift. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave this place and never look back. But something told me it wouldn't be that simple. This wasn't just a job, it was a trap, and I was caught in it. I tried to calm myself down, to breathe, but then the monitors flickered, one by one, coming back online. The feeds were still dim and distorted, but I could see the rooms again, except they weren't empty anymore. In room 7, the shadow figure was back, standing in the same spot as before, motionless. But now, there was something else. A small, faint red dot glowed in the corner of the screen, barely noticeable. It was as if the figure was watching me through a camera, a reversal of roles that sent a chill down my spine. I looked away, and my gaze fell on room 2. The hunched figure with the featureless face was back, but this time it was closer to the camera, its blank face pressed almost against the lens, as if it was trying to break through. Its head tilted at an odd angle, and I felt it staring into me, despite having no eyes. My skin crawled under its non-existent gaze. And then, to my horror, I noticed movement in the background of one of the other feeds, room 5. Another figure, suspended in midair, floating just inches off the ground. This one looked even stranger, almost skeletal, its body stretched and elongated, as if it had been pulled and twisted to fit its confinement. It shifted slowly, turning toward the camera, revealing a mouth that stretched too wide, splitting open into an unnatural gaping grin. My hand hovered over the phone, but I couldn't bring myself to call Dr. Wren again. What would I even say? That the shadows were watching me, that the figures were multiplying, spreading through the rooms like a disease? Somehow, I knew he wouldn't be surprised. The whispering returned, low and insistent, vibrating through the room, but this time I could make out fragments of words. They were broken, distorted, like a recording being played backward, but one phrase kept surfacing over and over. Let us out. Let us out. Let us out. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever these things were, they were aware of me, that they knew I was the one watching. And worse, they seemed to think I was the only thing standing between them and freedom. I sat frozen in my chair, unable to tear my eyes away from the screens. The figures seemed to pulse with every second, like they were building up some unseen energy, pushing against the boundaries of their confinement. The air in the room grew thick, and I could barely breathe. It felt like the whole building was pressing down on me. Then something changed. A single door appeared on the feed from room 1, a door I hadn't noticed before. It was the same type of door I'd seen in the hallway, heavy and metal, with no handles or markings. But in the shadowy room, it seemed out of place, like it didn't belong there. And then, without warning, the door on the screen slowly creaked open. I sat forward, staring at the screen in disbelief. None of the other rooms had any doors. This facility was supposed to be sealed, secure. But as I watched, the shadow from room 7 slid into room 1, crossing over through that open doorway, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, like it had all the time in the world, and then it vanished into the darkness. I felt the bile rise in my throat. Whatever that door was, wherever it led, it wasn't supposed to be open. I grabbed the phone, my hands trembling, and dialed Dr. Wren's number. It rang several times before he picked up, his voice as calm as ever. But before I could say anything, he spoke. "You saw the door, didn't you?" His tone was almost amused, like he'd been expecting this. I struggled to find my voice, feeling a mix of anger and fear. "What? What is happening here?" I managed, barely keeping the panic from breaking through. Things are moving. There's a door open in room 1. One of them crossed over. I thought they were supposed to be stable. Dr. Wren's silence was deafening. And then, after a long pause, he answered, "Stable is a relative term. They're as stable as we need them to be." "What does that even mean?" I asked, my voice rising. "Why did the door open? Where does it lead?" He let out a small sigh, as if I were asking a question with an obvious answer. The anomalies you're observing, they are contained, yes, but they have moments of lucidity, moments when they're aware of their confinement, aware of what we're doing. Occasionally, they find ways to test the boundaries. I gripped the phone tighter, feeling a chill creep over me. So, what am I supposed to do? Just sit here and watch them break free? Dr. Wren chuckled softly, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. Precisely. It's all part of the experiment. The anomalies need an observer. They need someone to witness, to record. And you, my friend, are serving that purpose. Why me? I whispered, horrified. Because you're replaceable, he replied, his voice cold. If you leave, someone else will take your place. The anomalies will find you no matter where you go. So sit tight and let them show you what they want. He hung up, leaving me alone in the silence, his words echoing in my head. Replaceable. I felt like a lab rat, a pawn in some twisted game that I couldn't escape. The door in room 1 remained open, a dark void beckoning, and I could feel it pulling me in, even from behind the screen. The clock read 5 a.m., only 3 hours to go. I forced myself to focus, to watch as the shadow continued moving through the rooms, slipping in and out of view. Each time it entered a new room, another figure appeared, like it was waking up others, spreading its influence. The hunched figure in room 2 began to twitch, its head snapping toward the camera as if sensing the change. The skeletal figure in room 5 lifted its head, its mouth stretching into that grotesque grin, watching with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The door in room 1 was open, and these things were moving with purpose, as if they were aware of something I wasn't. I could almost feel their whispers seeping into my mind, urging me to do something, to open something. And then it hit me. They weren't trying to break out of their rooms. They were trying to break in, into the monitoring room, the one room where they were being watched, where they were vulnerable. A sudden wave of dread washed over me as I realized that the door behind me, the one that had unlocked on its own, was their way in, and I was the one who'd let them in. The clock ticked to 5:30 a.m. I sat there, frozen, staring at the open door behind me. I could still feel that pull, a strange pressure drawing me toward it, like whatever was on the other side wanted me to walk through, to abandon my post and let them in. The feeds on the monitors began to glitch again, the screens flickering and distorting. Figures moved in and out of view, shadows slipping through the rooms like dark tendrils, spreading across the facility. Each room was darker now, the lights dimming as the entities moved from space to space, growing bolder, more tangible. And that door in room 1, it was still open, waiting. Every instinct told me to leave, to bolt out of the monitoring room and get out of this place. But Dr. Wren's words echoed in my head. The anomalies need an observer. I was here for a reason. The whole facility, the rooms, the entities, it all centered on this one room and this one feed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the minute I walked away, I'd be handing over whatever they wanted. I forced myself to focus on the monitors. The clock read 5:45 a.m. Just over 2 hours left until my shift ended. I just needed to hold out, to keep my eyes on the screens and keep them from moving any further. But as I watched, the figures seemed to grow restless, their movements becoming more erratic, more frantic. The hunched figure in room 2 was no longer just staring at the camera. It was pounding on the walls, its limbs twisting in impossible angles as it slammed against the glass. The skeletal figure in room 5 now paced the room, its elongated body stretching and contorting, pressing up against the walls as if it was trying to break free. And then, as I watched in horror, the figure in room 7, the shadow that had started it all, turned, facing the camera head on. Its form wavered, shifting like smoke, and slowly, it raised a single hand, pointing directly at me. The whispering returned, louder than ever, filling the room with a cacophony of voices, all speaking in a twisted, fragmented language that I couldn't understand. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to muffle the sound. The whispers weren't just in the room, they were in my mind, filling every corner, every thought, until I could barely remember who I was, why I was here. And then I heard a voice, a single, clear voice cutting through the noise. It wasn't a whisper, it was my own voice, but it sounded different, hollow, detached. Let us in. I stumbled back, clutching the edge of the desk, my heart hammering in my chest. The words echoed in my mind, pulling at something deep inside me. I glanced back at the door, half expecting to see one of those figures standing there, waiting for me to open it. But the hallway was empty, silent, except for the pounding of my own heartbeat. Desperate, I picked up the phone and dialed Doctor. Ran again. The line rang and rang, each second dragging out like an eternity. Finally, he picked up, his voice calm, almost bored. Yes? Doctor? Ren, something's happening, I said, my voice shaking. They're trying to get in. The figures, the shadows, they're moving through the rooms. One of them, it pointed at me. I think it knows I'm here. There was a long silence on the other end, and then he let out a small, almost amused sigh. I told you, didn't I? You are their observer. They can sense you. They know you're watching. But they're trying to break in, I snapped, my voice rising. The door behind me, it unlocked by itself. They're trying to get into the monitoring room. What happens if they get in? Dr. Wren's voice dropped, becoming softer, almost conspiratorial. Then, the experiment will be complete. What experiment? I demanded, my frustration and fear boiling over. You said I was here to observe, but you didn't say anything about this. What are they? What do they want? Another silence, and then he spoke, his voice so low I could barely hear it. They are fragments, pieces of something, older, something that existed long before this facility, long before any of us. The rooms, the cameras, even you. You're all part of the containment. They need a human observer to maintain their stability, to keep them anchored. Without you, they're free to move, to spread. A cold realization washed over me. You mean? I'm the one keeping them locked up? Precisely, he replied, almost cheerfully. It's a delicate balance. They can't exist fully in our world without someone anchoring them, keeping them in line. But once they know they're being watched, they'll do anything to reach the observer, to consume them, to integrate. I was speechless, a sick feeling twisting in my stomach. I felt like a pawn in some cosmic game, caught between forces I couldn't understand, forces that had been waiting, watching, and now, finally, making their move. What happens if I leave? I whispered, barely able to get the words out. If you leave, Dr. Wren said, they will follow you. They will search for you, track you, no matter where you go. You can't escape them. The only way to survive is to finish the shift. Keep watching. Don't look away. When your shift ends, they'll return to their containment, and you can go back to your life. He hung up, leaving me alone in the silence once again. I stared at the phone, his words echoing in my mind. I was trapped. My only option was to stay, to keep watching until morning. But as I turned back to the monitors, I knew that wouldn't be easy. The shadow in room 7 had moved closer to the camera, filling the screen with its dark, amorphous shape. It seemed to pulse, almost like it was breathing, and I could feel it pressing against the screen, as if it was trying to break through. The skeletal figure in room 5 was now clawing at the walls, leaving long, jagged scratches in the glass, its twisted mouth opening and closing as if it was silently screaming. And the door in room 1 was still open, a dark, gaping void that seemed to draw the other figures toward it. They moved in unison, flowing through the rooms, their shapes melding and merging, forming a dark wave that spread across the facility, closing in on the monitoring room. The clock read 6:30 a.m., 90 minutes left. I forced myself to keep watching, my eyes glued to the screens, every nerve in my body on edge. The figures were getting closer, moving through the rooms, one by one, each step bringing them nearer, each movement more deliberate. I could feel their hunger, their need to break free, to reach me. And then, without warning, the screen went dark. All of them, every feed, every camera, black. I felt a cold panic grip me as I fumbled with the controls, trying to get the feeds back online. But the monitors were dead. The room plunged into silence. I was alone, cut off, and I could feel them coming closer, like a storm building just beyond the door. I backed away, my heart pounding, every instinct telling me to run, to get out of there. But I knew that if I left, I'd be breaking the containment, unleashing them into the world. I was the last barrier, the only thing standing between them and freedom. And then, in the darkness, I heard it, the creak of the door behind me, slowly, almost painfully, swinging open. I didn't want to turn around, but something compelled me, some force pulling me toward that open doorway. I could feel the air grow colder, the whispers louder, filling my mind, pressing down on me with a weight that was almost unbearable. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the shadow from room 7. It was no longer just a shape on a screen. It was here, in the room with me, a dark, towering figure that seemed to absorb all light, all life. It stretched out a hand, beckoning, and I could feel its pull, its hunger. Behind it, in the hallway, I could see the others, the skeletal figure, the hunched creature, and more, all of them emerging from the darkness, moving toward me, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. They had crossed over, and now they were here. The shadow loomed in the doorway, its form shifting and pulsing, as if it was barely contained within its own shape. Behind it, the other figures moved closer, merging into one dark, writhing mass that seemed to breathe, to grow. I could feel them pulling at me, drawing me forward, their whispers filling my mind like a chant. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the wall, my eyes darting to the clock. 6:45 a.m., only 15 minutes left. Dr. Wren had said if I could make it until the end of my shift, they'd return to containment. But with each second that passed, they seemed to gain more power, their forms becoming clearer, more solid. The shadow in front stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the room. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, cold and suffocating, like being plunged into ice water. It reached out, stretching a dark hand toward me, fingers elongated, reaching like tendrils. I wanted to scream, to move, to do something, but I was frozen in place. The whispers grew louder, voices overlapping, filling the room with a horrible, unnatural harmony. I could barely think, barely breathe, as the shadow's hand drew closer, its fingers brushing against my skin, cold as death. Then, through the fog of panic, an idea sparked, a desperate, last-ditch thought. If my role was to observe, to contain them by watching, then maybe I could still hold them back. With a trembling hand, I grabbed the flashlight from the desk. I didn't know if it would work, but it was the only thing I had. I clicked it on and shone the light directly at the shadow's face, hoping it would do something, anything, to stop it. The shadow recoiled, a horrible, distorted screech filling the room as the light hit it. It twisted and writhed, pulling back from the beam, its shape flickering like static. The other figures in the hallway shrank back as well, hissing and contorting, their forms melting into the darkness as the light cut through them. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. The flashlight was holding them back, keeping them at bay, but I knew it wouldn't last. The beam flickered, the batteries dying fast, and I could feel the shadows pressing in, testing the boundaries, waiting for the light to fade. 6:50 a.m. 10 minutes left. I held the flashlight steady, my hand shaking as the shadows crept closer, filling the room with that awful, bone-chilling whisper. They were pushing against the light, stretching and contorting, their bodies bending in impossible ways, their faces distorted and hollow. The flashlight flickered again, weaker this time, the beam barely cutting through the darkness. I could feel my strength waning, my mind unraveling as the shadows pressed closer, filling every corner, every crevice, like a rising tide of darkness. 6:55 a.m., 5 minutes, just 5 more minutes. I could see them now, clearer than ever. The skeletal figure with its twisted limbs, the hunched creature with its blank face, the shadow stretching out its hand, inches from my face. They were surrounding me, enclosing me, their whispers drowning out every thought, every sound. The flashlight sputtered, the beam fading to a dim glow. "Let us in," they chanted, their voices merging into one, filling my mind, my soul. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. I'd failed. I'd let them in. And now, I was theirs. But then, silence. I opened my eyes, blinking in the sudden blinding light. The clock read 7 a.m. The figures were gone. The room was empty. The monitors humming softly, each feed showing empty rooms, still and lifeless. The whispering had stopped, the air light and calm, as if nothing had happened. I collapsed onto the chair, barely able to process what I'd just been through. The shadows, the figures, whatever they were, they had vanished, pulled back into containment, as if they'd never been there. The door behind me clicked open, and I looked up to see Dr. Wren standing there, watching me with that same calm, detached smile. He stepped into the room, glancing at the monitors, his expression unreadable. "Congratulations," he said, his tone as cold as ever. "You made it through the night." I opened my mouth to say something, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. I felt drained, empty, like a part of me had been stripped away. I couldn't even bring myself to look at him. Dr. Wren placed a white envelope on the desk, his fingers lingering on it for a moment. "Your payment," he said, as promised. I stared at the envelope, the money suddenly feeling meaningless. I'd barely survived the night, and now, all I wanted was to get as far away from this place as possible. Dr. Wren turned to leave, but he paused in the doorway, glancing back at me with that unsettling smile. "You did well. Not everyone makes it. Perhaps we'll see you again." He left, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving me alone in the silence. I sat there for a long time, staring at the monitors, the empty rooms, the lifeless screens. I didn't know what I'd just witnessed, what I'd been part of. But I knew one thing for certain. I would never come back here again. I took the envelope, shoved it in my bag, and left the facility without looking back. As I drove away, I could still feel their presence, lingering in the back of my mind, like a shadow that had burrowed deep into my soul. Even now, I can still hear the faintest whisper, echoing in the silence, a reminder of what I'd seen, what I'd endured. Let us in. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when I close my eyes, I still feel them watching, waiting, because deep down, I know that they'll never stop. I found a dark web stream of experiments in a secret lab. One of the test subjects looked just like me. I know this is going to sound insane, but I've got no better place to put this out there. If I don't type this out, I'm pretty sure it'll eat away at me. You know that itch in the back of your mind that just won't let go? Yeah, that's been my life for the last few weeks. Let me give you some context first. I've been messing around with the dark web for a while now, mostly out of curiosity. I know, bad idea, right? But I was careful, or at least I thought I was. I didn't buy anything, or even dig into anything super weird, mostly just poked around forums and looked up random stuff. It's like exploring an abandoned building. You're curious, but always a little scared of what you might find. One night, I came across this thread called The Other Side of Life. Catchy title, right? It looked like one of those conspiracy boards where people post about everything from UFOs to government cover-ups. But something about this one was different. It wasn't just people throwing out theories. It felt like the posters knew something. They shared this eerie confidence, like they'd actually seen things we weren't supposed to know about. I kept scrolling, and someone had posted a link, an unmarked, anonymous link. The comments underneath it were mixed. Some people were hyping it up like it was something incredible, while others were warning, stay away, you don't want this. Of course, that only made me more curious. I wish I'd just closed the tab. The link led to a blank web page with a single video stream, low-res and grainy like it was filmed on an old security camera. There was no sound, and I couldn't see much at first. Just a long, wide hallway with metal doors on each side, like something out of a medical lab. Every few seconds, a figure in a white lab coat would walk down the hallway and disappear into one of the doors. There was this sterile, almost suffocating feeling to the whole scene. I don't know why, but I kept watching. Minutes passed and nothing changed, just the same lifeless hallway. I started feeling this weird dread, like I was about to see something I shouldn't. My gut was screaming at me to close the stream, but I couldn't. I was hooked, as if something was keeping me there. Then, one of the doors opened and they brought someone out. A person in a hospital gown, pale, barely able to stand. They had this vacant, almost broken look in their eyes, like they were lost inside themselves. Two lab workers, or whatever they were, practically dragged them down the hall. They stopped at another door, opened it, and shoved the person inside. The door clanked shut, and they walked off like it was the most normal thing in the world. I felt sick. My heart was racing, but I couldn't pull my eyes away. I knew I should have closed it. Anyone in their right mind would have. But then, the camera angle changed. It cut to a dimly lit room with a single chair in the center, strapped with leather belts. The person in the hospital gown was sitting there, slumped over, breathing heavily. The two lab workers stood by a control panel on the wall, flipping switches and pressing buttons, their faces completely blank. They were like robots, emotionless, just doing a job. Then, one of them pulled out a syringe. They injected something into the person's neck, and after a few seconds, they began to twitch. Slowly at first, just small jerks and twitches, but then it got worse. Their entire body started convulsing, thrashing against the restraints. It looked like they were in pain, but there was no sound, just the grainy video and that awful silence. I wanted to scream at my screen to make it stop, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my hand frozen on the mouse. It was like I was trapped in my own body, forced to watch. Then, they stopped. The person slumped forward, lifeless, their head hanging down. The lab workers didn't even check to see if they were okay. They just undid the straps, dragged them out of the room, and the screen cut back to the hallway. By then, I was sweating, my heart pounding. I wanted to tell myself it was just a sick prank, some twisted horror video made to scare people like me who'd be stupid enough to watch. But it felt too real. The terror in that person's eyes, the cold efficiency of the lab workers, didn't feel like acting. And I just sat there, glued to it, like some kind of messed up voyeur. I was about to close the page when I noticed something strange in the hallway camera feed. Another person in a hospital gown was being led out. Same blank look, same stumbling steps. But this one looked different. They had the same haircut as me, the same build. I squinted, leaning closer to the screen, trying to make out the details. The camera quality was low, but as they turned slightly, I saw their face clearly, and my heart dropped. They looked exactly like me. Same face, same expression. It was like staring at a twisted, hollow version of myself, lost and broken. I couldn't breathe. It felt like my entire body went cold, like someone had poured ice water through my veins. I scrambled to close the tab, but my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely click the mouse. I finally managed to close it and sat there in silence. The image of my own face, blank, empty, and tortured, burned into my mind. But the worst part? The camera wasn't just streaming. The next few hours were a blur. I sat there, staring at my computer screen, my mind racing in circles. It felt like I'd seen something I was never meant to see, something that didn't just feel wrong, but fundamentally messed up. But I couldn't shake the memory of my own face staring back at me, vacant and trapped. It was like a nightmare that had seeped into reality, and I had no clue what to do with it. I closed my laptop and tried to forget, telling myself it was some messed up coincidence, maybe a deep fake or a look-alike, anything to keep my sanity. But even though I shut my computer, the image was still there in my mind, haunting me every time I closed my eyes. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. But sleep didn't feel like an escape. I kept dreaming about that room, the sterile hallways, the people in lab coats with those empty, dead expressions. It was like my brain was trying to process what I'd seen, going over every detail, every moment, over and over again. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat. I told myself it was just a bad dream, just a dark web prank that had gotten to me. But as I sat up and reached for my phone, I noticed something that froze me in place. There was a notification, an email, with no sender name, no subject line, just a blank space where both should have been. I've been online long enough to know that's not normal. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The email had only one line of text: "You shouldn't have watched." I felt my heart skip a beat. My hands went cold. It was just 5 words, but it felt like someone was watching me, like I'd been marked. My first instinct was to delete it, but before I could, another notification popped up, another email. Same blank sender, same blank subject line. This one had a single attachment, a photo. My stomach sank as I opened it. It was a grainy, low-res image of my bedroom, taken from the corner near my window. I could see myself asleep in my bed, sheets tangled around me. The photo was timestamped from last night, around 3 a.m. A sick realization washed over me. Someone had been in my room, standing over me while I slept. I couldn't explain it. I had locked the door, checked all the windows. I was alone, but somehow they had been in here, close enough to take a photo. Panic surged through me. I didn't feel safe anymore. My room, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. I threw open my door and checked every corner, every closet. Nothing. No sign anyone had been here, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I was losing it, I thought. This had to be some kind of elaborate trick, a prank gone too far. I tried to convince myself of that as I packed a bag, grabbing my essentials and throwing on a jacket. I needed to clear my head, and I definitely didn't want to be alone in my apartment. I got in my car and drove aimlessly, just trying to calm down, let the tension ease out of my shoulders. But the paranoia stayed with me. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, it felt like someone was sitting in the back seat, staring right at me. I ended up at a coffee shop, the kind that stays open all night, and ordered the strongest thing they had, hoping the caffeine would drown out the fear. I found a corner table, away from the windows, and kept my head down. But I could still feel my pulse pounding, the lingering anxiety I couldn't shake. As I sat there, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself, another notification came through. I hesitated, dread pooling in my stomach. Against all logic, I opened it. It was another email from the same blank address. Watch again. There was another link, identical to the one I'd clicked on last night. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to ignore it, to just walk away. But curiosity won out again. I wanted to tell myself it was just some weird video, just something meant to scare people, but it felt personal, like this was directed at me. So I clicked it. The stream was up again, the same sterile hallway, same metal doors. But this time, the view was closer, almost as if the camera had been moved, giving me a clearer shot of the doors themselves. One of them had a small label on it, a number printed in tiny, almost faded letters, 0013. I watched as the same white coat workers walked down the hallway. There was something off about their movements, something mechanical and unnatural, like they weren't even human. They stopped at door 0013, and my heart dropped. They opened it, and I saw someone inside. A man, slumped against the wall, barely moving. He looked like he'd been there for days, unshaven, his clothes ragged and dirty. The lab workers pulled him to his feet, dragging him out of the cell, his body limp like a rag doll. They strapped him into the chair in that dimly lit room, and one of them reached for another syringe. My stomach twisted as I watched, but this time, something was different. As they injected him, his head jerked up, and he looked straight into the camera. For a moment, it was like he knew I was watching, like he was looking right at me. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. He was trying to say something, pleading, his eyes wide with terror. Then, the stream glitched. The screen went black for a second, and when it came back on, the room was empty. The man was gone, the chair empty. Just the two lab workers standing there, expressionless, staring into the camera. The feed cut out again, and this time, it stayed black. My mind was racing. The image of that man's terrified face burned into my brain. I felt like he'd been trying to tell me something, some desperate plea. It was like he was calling out to me specifically, like he knew I was watching, like he needed me to know something. Then my phone buzzed. Another email. This one had a video attached. I almost didn't open it, but my hands moved on their own, shaky and tense. I tapped on the file, and it started playing. It was a video of me, sitting at my corner table in the coffee shop, looking at my phone, right now. I could see myself from a distance, the same angle, the same seat, even the same drink, sitting untouched in front of me. I looked around the coffee shop, my heart pounding, but there was no one watching me. No one with a camera or phone out. But someone had taken that video, and they were close. Closer than I ever could have imagined. I grabbed my bag and bolted, leaving my half-finished coffee behind. I didn't go home after that. I couldn't. The thought of stepping back into my apartment, where they'd somehow managed to take that photo of me sleeping, was more than I could handle. The sense of being watched had settled deep into my bones, making it impossible to feel safe anywhere. Instead, I drove around aimlessly, trying to get as far from the coffee shop as possible. The roads were dark and empty, just the glow of streetlights casting eerie shadows as I sped through the city. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone tailing me. But each time, there was nothing. Just empty roads stretching out behind me. I eventually found myself on the outskirts of town, near an old motel that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 80s. I pulled into the lot, hoping a change of scenery would help me clear my head. The place was cheap, run down, the kind of place people went to disappear for a night. It felt like exactly what I needed. I checked in under a fake name, paid cash, and got the key to room 207. The room itself was dingy and smelled faintly of mildew, but I didn't care. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and shoved a chair under the doorknob, just in case. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe. I lay down on the bed, trying to relax, telling myself that everything I'd seen was just some elaborate trick, a prank, or a scam meant to mess with people on the dark web. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real. The way that man had looked at the camera, the emails, the video from the coffee shop, none of it felt like a game. Exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a restless sleep, haunted by images of that dimly lit room, the blank faces of the lab workers, and that man's terrified eyes. I don't know how long I was asleep before I woke up to the sound of a car engine outside. At first, I thought it was just someone parking in the lot, but the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my window. My heart raced as I peeked through a crack in the curtains, careful not to be seen. In the dim glow of the motel's parking lot lights, I saw a black van idling outside my room, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. It just sat there, engine running, as if waiting for something. Panic set in. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone else had rented the room next to mine. But something about that van felt wrong, like it was here for me, watching, waiting. I thought about making a run for it, but I knew they'd see me. The only other exit was a small window in the bathroom, barely big enough to squeeze through. I didn't have any other choice. I grabbed my bag, stuffing my phone and wallet inside, and crept to the bathroom. I opened the window as quietly as I could, glancing back to make sure the van was still there. It hadn't moved. I took a deep breath, pushed myself through the window, and dropped down onto the gravel behind the motel. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I forced myself to stay calm, creeping around the side of the building, trying to stay out of sight. My car was parked near the front entrance, but I couldn't risk going back. They'd see me. Instead, I ducked into the shadows and started walking, keeping low, moving as quickly as I could without drawing attention. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away, put as much distance between me and that van as possible. After a few blocks, I dared to look back. The van was there, creeping slowly down the street, its headlights off, moving with a kind of unsettling patience, as if it had all the time in the world to find me. I ducked into an alley, pressing myself against the wall, hoping the shadows would hide me. I could hear the van's engine humming as it rolled past the alley, But it didn't stop. It continued down the street, and I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. But as soon as I thought I was safe, my phone buzzed. I almost jumped out of my skin. My hand shook as I pulled it out of my pocket, half expecting another blank email, another message telling me they knew where I was. But this time, it was a text. "We're not far. You can't hide." My stomach dropped. I didn't recognize the number, but somehow I knew it was them. They had been tracking me, following my every move. I realized with a sickening clarity that this wasn't just a random prank or an elaborate scare. They were hunting me, watching me through some invisible lens I couldn't escape. I turned off my phone, heart racing, and bolted from the alley, my feet pounding against the pavement as I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just away, as far as I could get from that motel, that van, that horrifying text. I eventually stumbled into a neighborhood I didn't recognize, a quiet street with darkened houses and empty sidewalks. I slowed down, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing, trying to piece together what was happening. It was like they were playing a game, one I didn't know the rules to, but I had a feeling I was losing. Just then, a light flickered on in the window of the house across the street. I froze, watching as the curtain shifted and a figure appeared, silhouetted against the dim glow of the room. For a second, I thought it was just someone waking up, disturbed by the noise. But then I saw it, their face. It was the same blank, lifeless expression I'd seen on the lab workers, staring out into the night with those empty eyes. They were watching me. A shiver ran down my spine as I backed away, realizing that this wasn't just some isolated group of people in lab coats. They were everywhere, scattered among us, hidden in plain sight. I turned and ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty street. I didn't stop until I reached an old park, ducking behind a row of trees, gasping for air. My mind was spinning, fear gnawing at the edges of my sanity. They'd found me once. They could find me again. No matter where I went, they would be watching, waiting. And I had no idea how to stop them. I don't know how long I stayed hidden behind those trees, crouched down in the shadows, every nerve on edge. My breaths were shallow, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. My mind was racing with questions, but none of them had answers. How were they tracking me? Why were they so interested in me? And most terrifying of all, what did they want? The park was silent, just the rustle of leaves and the occasional distant hum of traffic. I was about to move, to slip out from the shadows and keep going, when I heard a faint noise nearby, a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it had a rhythm to it, a subtle rise and fall, like someone speaking under their breath. I pressed myself closer to the tree, straining to hear. It was barely audible, but unmistakable. A low, rasping voice coming from somewhere nearby. "Can't hide. We see you." My skin crawled. It felt like the voice was coming from all around me, filling the air, slipping into my ears no matter how hard I tried to block it out. I scanned the park, but there was no one in sight. Just me, alone in the dark, with that voice echoing in my head. "Run all you want. It won't matter." I forced myself to breathe, gripping the rough bark of the tree, grounding myself, trying to stay calm. I didn't want to believe the voice was real, but it felt like it was speaking directly to me, like it was inside my head. I closed my eyes, whispering to myself that it was just paranoia, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, the voice grew louder, closer, like it was right behind me. "Turn around." I froze. The words echoed in my mind, and a chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see whatever was waiting for me, but the urge was overpowering, pulling me like a magnet. Against every instinct, I slowly turned, half expecting to see one of those lab workers standing inches away. But there was nothing, just darkness, stretching out into the empty park. My hands were shaking. I could still hear the voice, faint and fading, like it was retreating back into the shadows, leaving me alone. But the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes boring into me, was still there, relentless and suffocating. I stumbled out of the park, half blind with panic, my legs weak beneath me. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. I was running on pure adrenaline, fear and confusion twisting into a sickening knot in my stomach. I didn't want to think about the emails, the photos, the way that man had looked at me through the camera. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape it. Finally, I ended up on the edge of town, near a row of abandoned warehouses. I don't know what led me there, maybe desperation or some instinct to hide where no one would think to look. The place was dark and empty, the windows shattered, the walls covered in graffiti. It was perfect. Isolated. I slipped inside, finding a corner in the shadows, hidden from the street. I needed a moment to breathe, to pull myself together, to make sense of what was happening. But as I sat there, trying to calm myself, my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. My fingers trembled as I took it out, my heart sinking, as I saw yet another blank email. This one was different. There was no link, no photo, just a single line of text. Come find us. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. My thoughts raced, torn between fear and a strange, overwhelming urge to know more. It felt like they were taunting me, daring me to go deeper, to take that next step. I almost threw my phone away, but then a new message popped up, this time with an address. My heart skipped a beat. It was close by, just a few blocks from where I was hiding. My instincts screamed at me to ignore it, to run as far as I could and never look back. But something in me wanted answered, needed to know who was doing this to me and why. I couldn't live like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next email or message to pop up. So, against every ounce of reason, I got up and started walking toward the address. The streets were deserted, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hum of passing cars. My footsteps echoed as I approached the building, a nondescript concrete structure with no signs, no windows, just a heavy metal door with a security camera perched above it, watching me. I hesitated, feeling that familiar dread wash over me, but I couldn't turn back now. I needed to see this through. I knocked once, twice, the sound ringing out in the silence. For a moment, nothing happened. I was about to leave when the door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway beyond. I stepped inside, heart pounding, my every instinct screaming at me to run. But the door swung shut behind me with a heavy clang, sealing me in. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. I walked forward, each step echoing in the silence, my eyes darting around, half expecting someone to jump out at me. But the hallway was empty, eerily quiet, just the sound of my own breathing filling the air. At the end of the hall was another door, this one marked with a number, 0013. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. I recognized that number, the same one I'd seen on the door in the video stream. The memory of that man's terrified face flashed through my mind, his silent pleas, his desperate eyes. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking, and pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark, save for a single spotlight illuminating a chair in the center, the same chair I'd seen in the stream, with those familiar leather straps hanging limply from the arms and legs. And there, slumped in the chair, was someone. My heart stopped as I took in their face, the dark hair, the hollow eyes, the familiar curve of their jaw. It was me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, my mind reeling. It couldn't be real. It was impossible. But there I was, staring at myself, strapped into that chair, looking as lifeless and hollow as the people I'd seen in the video. My double raised their head, their eyes locking onto mine. They opened their mouth, whispering something so faint I could barely hear it. Help me. The words sent a chill down my spine, freezing me in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. It was like I was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as this twisted version of myself pleaded with me, their voice weak and broken. Then the lights flickered and the room went dark. When the lights came back on, the chair was empty. My double was gone, leaving only the echo of their whispered plea hanging in the air. I staggered back, panic surging through me as I turned and bolted for the door. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out to escape the nightmare that was closing in around me. But as I reached the hallway, I saw them, the lab workers, standing in the shadows, their faces blank and emotionless, watching me with those empty eyes. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched, silent and still, as I backed away, heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to run. And then, just before I turned to flee, one of them raised a hand, pointing directly at me. You're next. I turned and ran, the walls of the hallway seeming to close in on me. My footsteps echoed wildly, bouncing off the sterile, cold concrete as I sprinted down the corridor, desperate to escape. The image of my own face, broken and pleading, was burned into my mind. That whispered plea, help me, chasing me down the hall. I burst out of the building and into the open air, gasping, the cold night biting into my skin. I didn't stop. I kept running, barely aware of my surroundings, weaving through darkened streets until I was miles from that place, my heart still hammering in my chest. I didn't even know where I was going anymore. It was pure survival instinct, an animalistic drive to keep as far away from that nightmare as possible. When I finally stopped, I found myself in a part of town I didn't recognize, a desolate industrial area with empty warehouses looming over me like dark giants. I leaned against a wall, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. None of it made sense. The emails, the video stream, the figure that looked like me. It was like a fever dream, a twisted hallucination that wouldn't end. Then my phone buzzed. The sound was sharp and invasive in the silence, slicing through the night. I pulled it out, hands shaking, and looked at the screen. Another email. This time, there was no text, no subject line, just an image. I hesitated, dread pooling in my stomach, but I couldn't stop myself from opening it. It was a picture of me, taken only moments ago, leaning against the very wall where I now stood. The photo was crystal clear, capturing the fear on my face, the sweat on my brow, the way I was gripping my phone as if it were a lifeline. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Someone was here, watching me, close enough to take this picture without me even noticing. I spun around, scanning the shadows, but the street was empty, not a single sign of life. But I knew they were there, somewhere, watching. I backed away, feeling that familiar panic rising again, and just then, another notification popped up. This time, it was a text message from the same unknown number that had sent me the address. It simply read, come home. My mind reeled. I hadn't told anyone where I lived, hadn't shared any personal details online, hadn't left any traces. Yet they knew. These people, whoever they were, had somehow traced me all the way to my home. I didn't want to go. I wanted to burn every bridge, run as far as I could, but I knew they'd never stop. This wasn't something I could escape. So, against every ounce of instinct, I walked back to my car, climbed inside and drove. The streets were dark and empty, the city stretching out around me like a vast, indifferent machine. The quiet was almost surreal, the headlights slicing through the night as I made my way back to my apartment. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadow or figure lurking in the back seat, but there was nothing. Just me, alone in the car, heading toward whatever lay waiting. When I finally arrived, the building was dark and quiet, no sign of anything unusual. I climbed the stairs, feeling like I was walking into a trap, the weight of dread pressing down on me. The hallway to my apartment stretched out before me, dim and empty. I stopped in front of my door, hand hovering over the handle. My heart pounded as I turned the key and stepped inside, flipping on the lights. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Everything was still, ordinary, untouched. But the sense of wrongness was overwhelming, like I was walking through a set, a hollow imitation of my own life. I set my bag down, forcing myself to breathe, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. Maybe it was over, I told myself. Maybe they were done with me, that they'd had their fun and moved on to some other poor soul. But as I moved toward my bedroom, I saw something that stopped me cold. There, on the wall opposite my bed, was a small black camera, its lens aimed directly at the pillow where I slept. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, realizing that someone had been watching me, studying me in my most vulnerable moments. I reached for the camera, ripping it from the wall, feeling a mix of fury and terror. But as I did, my phone buzzed again. Another message. We're closer than you think. The room went cold. I backed away, every nerve on edge, feeling that horrible, suffocating presence closing in. And then I noticed something else, a thin crack in the wall, near the spot where I'd found the camera. It was so faint, so subtle, that I'd never noticed it before. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a crack. It was a door, disguised and painted, to blend in with the wall, nearly invisible. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to get out while I still could, but my body moved on its own, compelled by a strange, horrible curiosity. I pushed on the door and it swung open, revealing a dark stairwell leading down into the depths of the building. Every instinct told me to turn back, to slam the door shut and run, but I couldn't. I had to know. I stepped into the stairwell, the door swinging shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. The air was thick and stale, the walls lined with pipes that stretched down into the shadows. I took each step slowly, the silence pressing in around me, broken only by the faint hum of machinery somewhere below. The deeper I went, the colder it grew, a chill that sank into my bones. At the bottom of the stairs, I found another door, this one made of heavy steel, with a keypad beside it. But as I approached, the door clicked open on its own, as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside. The room was identical to the one I'd seen on the stream. Dimly lit, sterile, with a single chair in the center and those familiar leather straps. My stomach twisted as I took in the details. The same bare walls, the same cold, clinical lighting. And there, standing in the corner, was a figure in a lab coat, their face hidden in shadow. They turned to face me, their eyes empty, expressionless, like the others I'd seen in the videos. They watched me in silence, their gaze piercing, as if they could see straight through me. And then, in a voice that echoed through the empty room, they spoke. "You've been chosen." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen, trapped, as they stepped closer, their face slowly coming into the light. It was me, the same face, the same eyes, staring back at me with that hollow, lifeless expression. I stumbled back, my mind spiraling, unable to process what I was seeing. It felt like I was trapped in some twisted mirror, facing a version of myself that had been hollowed out, drained of everything that made me me. My double stepped forward, reaching out a hand, and in that moment, I felt something shift inside me. A strange, heavy pull, like they were drawing something out of me, something vital. The room spun, my vision blurring as darkness crept in at the edges. I tried to fight it, tried to hold on, but the force was too strong, too overwhelming. It felt like I was being drained, my very essence slipping away, leaving me hollow, empty. As the darkness closed in, I heard their voice echoing in my mind, cold and final. "Welcome to the other side." And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment, lying in my bed. The morning sun was streaming through the window, warm and gentle. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, some twisted hallucination brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But as I sat up, a sense of wrongness settled over me. I glanced around the room, feeling disconnected, like I was seeing everything through a fog. My movements felt slow, mechanical, as if I were on autopilot. And then I saw it, my reflection in the mirror across the room. The person staring back at me looked like me, but there was something missing, something hollow and empty in their eyes. It was the same expression I'd seen on the lab workers, on the man in the stream, on the version of myself I'd met in that room. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And that's when I realized, with a sickening clarity, that I wasn't alone anymore. There was something inside me, something dark and hollow, lurking just beneath the surface, watching through my own eyes. And I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before it took over completely. I was hired to guard a government facility. The lab isn't supposed to exist. Alright, so I've never posted on here before, but after what happened, I need to get this off my chest. If someone out there has been through anything remotely similar, maybe they'll understand. Or maybe I'm just insane. I really don't know anymore. For a bit of background, I'm not the kind of guy who jumps at shadows. I used to work as a night guard in a pretty rough neighborhood, so I know what real fear feels like. You don't last in that line of work if you're easily spooked. But what happened at this new job? Well, it's something else entirely. It all started when I got laid off last year. The security company I worked for went under, and, well, finding work in my town isn't exactly easy. So, when I saw an ad online for a security guard position that paid almost double what I was used to, I jumped on it. No background check, no resume needed, just a quick interview with a guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else but there. The first red flag was the location. The job was in the middle of nowhere, like seriously off the grid. They wouldn't tell me anything over the phone, only that it was government-related and highly classified. I wasn't even given the exact address until I'd accepted the job. They just told me to show up at a random gas station at midnight and that someone would pick me up. I figured it was some hush-hush military site, or maybe one of those research labs you hear about on conspiracy podcasts. But the pay was too good to pass up, and honestly, I thought it'd be an easy gig. Just sit around, keep an eye on things, and collect my paycheck. When I got to the gas station, a black SUV pulled up. This guy in a suit, seriously, like one of those men in black types, gestured for me to get in. He didn't say a word the whole drive, just stared ahead, with this blank expression. I tried to make some small talk, but it was like talking to a brick wall. Eventually I gave up and just stared out the window, watching as we left the city behind and headed deeper into the forest. We drove for what felt like hours. The trees grew denser and the roads got rougher until we finally reached this big metal gate hidden behind a wall of trees. There were no signs, no markings, nothing to suggest it was a government facility or even a building at all. Just a solid, unmarked gate that slid open when we pulled up. The SUV stopped and the man turned to me, finally speaking. "You're here to do your job. Don't ask questions. Don't go where you're not supposed to. And if you see anything unusual, you report it. That's all." He handed me a key card and a flashlight, then pointed me toward a small, windowless building near the entrance. "Your post is inside. Just sit at the monitors, watch, and wait until morning. Do not leave until your shift is over." At this point, I'm thinking, all right, maybe this is one of those high security research sites. I'm not dumb. Stuff happens that the public doesn't know about, but the guy's warning stuck with me. If you see anything unusual, report it. What kind of unusual are we talking about here? But he was already back in the SUV, and before I could ask, he drove off, leaving me alone in the middle of nowhere. So I made my way inside. The building was bare, with concrete walls and a metal desk facing a set of monitors. It looked like the place hadn't been updated since the 90s. The monitors showed various camera feeds, mostly of empty hallways, storage rooms, and the main gate. There was no sign of any lab equipment, no scientists in lab coats, nothing you'd expect from a government facility. Just empty rooms, all looking eerily identical. My shift started quietly enough. I sat there, sipping my coffee, bored out of my mind. The hours ticked by, and I was beginning to wonder if I'd been hired to watch an abandoned building. But then, just as I was about to doze off, one of the cameras caught my attention. It was in a hallway, near the far end of the building, somewhere I hadn't seen any activity all night. There was a shape. I couldn't tell if it was a person or just some weird shadow, but it moved, just barely. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen, and for a second I thought I saw eyes staring back at me. Cold, unblinking eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe a glitch in the feed. But then it happened again. This time, on another monitor. The same figure, standing perfectly still at the edge of the frame, as if it knew I was watching. I felt this creeping dread in my stomach, like a primal instinct warning me to get out of there. But I stayed. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably nothing. Besides, I wasn't about to risk losing the best paying job I'd ever had over a creepy shadow. But then, around 3 a.m., the radio crackled to life. I hadn't even realized I'd been given one. It was this small, old-fashioned walkie-talkie sitting on the desk, and it suddenly buzzed with static, followed by a voice, one I didn't recognize. "Code Alpha. Sector D." The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. I had no idea what Code Alpha or Sector D meant, but something told me it wasn't good. I looked at the monitors, searching for any sign of movement, and that's when I saw it. The shadow was back, only this time, it wasn't alone. There were 3 of them now, standing in a line down one of the hallways. They were barely visible in the dim light, but I could make out their silhouettes, tall, thin, and unnaturally still. They didn't move. They just stood there, as if waiting for something. I grabbed the walkie-talkie and pressed the button, my voice shaking. Hello? Can anyone hear me? I'm seeing something in the hallway. Is this part of the protocol? Silence. Then, more static. Finally, that same voice came through again, even softer this time. Stay where you are. Do not engage. Engage? What did that even mean? But before I could process it, the feed on the monitors flickered, and suddenly, all the screens went black. I sat there in the dark, the only light coming from the dull glow of the radio. My heart was pounding, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out. But where was I supposed to go? I was miles from anything resembling civilization, and I couldn't even remember the way back to the main road. I flicked the flashlight on, its weak beam barely cutting through the darkness. I tried to remember everything the guy in the SUV told me. Stay at your post. Report anything unusual. It all sounded like standard protocol for any security job. But there was nothing standard about this place. The silence was suffocating. All I could hear was the faint hum of machinery, somewhere deep within the walls, and my own breathing, loud and shaky. I kept glancing at the monitors, even though they were dead. My mind was racing. Who were those figures? And why did they stand so still, like statues? A faint tapping sound suddenly echoed down the hall outside the room. Tap, 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 slow and deliberate. I gripped the flashlight tighter, taking a deep breath, and forced myself to stand. The tapping grew louder, more distinct, like someone, or something, was dragging metal across concrete. Against every rational thought in my head, I opened the door and peered into the corridor. The hall stretched into darkness on either side, with only the emergency lights casting a faint red glow every few feet. The sound was coming from somewhere down the left, echoing and distorted, making it hard to pinpoint. I should have stayed put. I know that now, but something about that sound felt like a challenge, like it was daring me to come closer. So I took a few steps down the hall, my flashlight flickering as if it, too, was afraid. As I approached the source of the sound, I noticed something odd about the walls. They were covered in these strange symbols, etched into the concrete like deep scratches. Circles, triangles, lines intersecting in ways that didn't make sense. I'd never seen anything like them before. They looked ancient, like they belonged in some lost language. But why were they here, in a government facility? The tapping suddenly stopped. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The silence was worse than the sound. I held my breath, listening, straining my ears for any hint of movement. Then, from just around the corner, a whisper. Help? Me? It was barely audible, like someone gasping for breath. The voice was faint and strained, but it was definitely human. I hesitated, my brain wrestling between the urge to help and the instinct to run. The voice sounded desperate, broken. Against my better judgment, I took a step forward. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky and unsure. Are you okay? Silence. I took another step, the flashlight flickering again, and slowly rounded the corner. The hallway was empty, save for an open door at the far end, leading into a pitch-black room. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my grip on the flashlight tightened as I moved closer. The door looked old and heavy, reinforced with thick metal bars and a faded label that read, "Restricted." I reached out to touch it, and the instant my fingers brushed the cold metal, the voice returned. Help. Me. This time, it was clearer, louder. It came from inside the room. Against every rational thought screaming at me to turn around, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was unlike anything I'd seen in the facility so far. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, covered in thick layers of dust, as if no one had been here for decades. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mold and something else I couldn't quite place. A metallic tang that stuck to the back of my throat. In the center of the room was a single chair, bolted to the floor. Restraints hung from the armrests, old and rusted, and the floor around it was stained with dark, splotchy marks. It looked like something out of a horror movie, the kind of thing they'd use in an interrogation room. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I fought the urge to leave. I took a step closer, my flashlight aimed at the chair, and that's when I noticed it, something small and metallic glinting on the floor. I knelt down and picked it up, squinting to make it out in the dim light. It was an old-fashioned key, heavy and tarnished. The door suddenly slammed shut behind me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I spun around, but there was no one there. I was alone. Or, at least I thought I was. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard breathing. Slow, labored breathing, like someone struggling to take each breath. I turned back, my flashlight casting frantic beams across the walls. But there was nothing there, just that chair, sitting ominously in the center of the room. I could feel the fear building, creeping up my spine and filling my head with this overwhelming urge to run. But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the chair. And then, as I stared, I noticed something horrifying. There were scratch marks on the floor around the chair, deep, desperate scratches, as if someone had been clawing at the ground trying to break free. I felt sick, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. What the hell kind of place was this? The breathing grew louder, coming from all around me now, filling the room with this suffocating, oppressive presence. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel it, this overwhelming sense of being watched. I reached for the walkie-talkie, my hands trembling, and pressed the button. I think there's something in here with me, I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. Hello? Can anyone hear me? Static. Then, the same voice from earlier, barely a whisper. Leave. Now. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and yanked at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in, and I started banging on it, shouting for help, but my voice echoed uselessly in the empty room. Then, the breathing stopped, replaced by something even worse. A faint, almost imperceptible humming. A low, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, a noise that made my skin crawl. In my desperation, I remembered the key in my hand. I jammed it into the door, praying it would fit, and to my shock, it turned. The door clicked open, and I stumbled out, my heart racing as I sprinted down the hallway. As I ran, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something chasing me, but the hallway was empty. The humming had stopped, replaced by the faint, mocking echo of my own footsteps. I didn't stop until I was back at the security room, slamming the door shut behind me. I collapsed into the chair, gasping for breath, and looked at the monitors. They were still black, but I could see my own reflection in the glass, pale, wide-eyed, and terrified. And just as I thought I was safe, the walkie-talkie crackled to life again. They're coming. I sat there, staring at the walkie-talkie in my trembling hands, feeling the weight of those two words sink in. They're coming. My mind raced with 100 questions, each one more terrifying than the last. Who was coming, and why were they after me? I felt trapped, like prey that knew it had nowhere to run. My heart pounded in my ears as I forced myself to check the monitors again, hoping they'd come back online. The screens flickered, and one by one, the feeds slowly returned. But something was wrong. Every camera showed the same hallway, the one just outside the security room, with that same dull, red emergency lighting, casting eerie shadows along the walls. At first, there was nothing, just an empty hallway, silent and still. I leaned forward, squinting at the monitor, praying it was just a glitch. But then, movement. A figure emerged from the far end of the hall, slowly walking toward the camera. My blood ran cold. The figure was tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its bones, almost translucent under the dim light. I couldn't make out a face, just hollow, dark patches where eyes should be. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like it wasn't used to its own body. And then, as if sensing my gaze, it stopped and looked straight into the camera. For a second, I thought it could see me, like it knew I was watching. A shiver ran down my spine as it tilted its head, almost in curiosity, before resuming its slow, methodical walk toward the security room. Toward me. I scrambled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. Another figure appeared, and then another, each one identical, each one moving in that same unsettling, mechanical way. Soon, there were 6 of them, all making their way down the hallway, all coming straight for me. I reached for the door, my hand hovering over the lock, but a part of me knew it was pointless. I was alone, isolated, and no one was coming to help. The only exit was the gate, and I doubted I'd make it that far. But staying in this room was just as dangerous. I glanced at the monitors one last time. The figures were getting closer, their twisted faces now clearly visible in the camera's grainy resolution. With a deep breath, I steeled myself and slipped into the hallway, moving as quietly as I could. The red emergency lights barely illuminated the path, casting shadows that seemed to shift and stretch, as if something was watching me from every corner. I gripped the flashlight tightly, praying it wouldn't flicker out again. The facility was a maze, each corridor blending into the next, with doors that led to nowhere and turns that made no sense. It was like the place was designed to keep you lost, to trap you within its walls. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. As I rounded a corner, I heard footsteps echoing from behind. Slow, dragging footsteps that sent a chill through my entire body. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath, listening as they grew closer, louder. And then, silence. I exhaled, just barely, hoping they'd passed. But then I heard something else, a faint scraping, like nails dragging along concrete. I dared to peek around the corner, and there, barely a few feet away, was one of the figures. It stood still, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, its empty gaze fixed on the floor. I could see its fingers, long and bony, scraping against the wall, as if it were feeling its way through the dark. I pulled back, heart hammering, and forced myself to keep moving, careful to stay out of sight. My footsteps were muffled, barely audible, but every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, like they were pushing me deeper into the facility, towards something. Finally, I came across a door marked Research Wing. It was slightly ajar, and I slipped inside, hoping I'd find some place to hide. The room was massive, with rows of metal tables and strange, unmarked equipment scattered everywhere. Fluorescent lights flickered above, casting an unnatural glow over the space. As I crept further into the room, I noticed glass containers lining the walls. Each one held something odd, strange specimens floating in murky liquid, things that looked almost human, but weren't. Limbs with too many joints, faces without eyes, torsos that seemed stitched together in a way that defied anatomy. It was like a twisted museum of things that shouldn't exist. I forced myself to look away, focusing on finding a place to hide. At the far end of the room was a storage closet, the door slightly open. I ducked inside, closing it just enough to leave a sliver to look through. My breathing was shallow, each exhale a struggle to keep quiet. The footsteps returned, louder this time, echoing off the metal tables as they entered the room. I held my breath, peering through the crack, and watched as one of the figures shuffled past, its movements jerky and erratic. It paused near one of the containers, its head tilting, as if it recognized something inside. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Its fingers splayed out in a sick parody of affection. I bit down on my lip, fighting the urge to scream, and watched as more figures filed into the room, each one moving toward a different container. They stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something, their hollow faces reflected in the murky glass. And then they began to hum. The sound was low and unsettling, like a drone vibrating through the air, filling the room with this oppressive weight. The glass containers started to tremble, and the strange specimens inside began to twitch, their lifeless limbs jerking, as if trying to break free. I backed away from the door, my heart racing, and fumbled for the walkie-talkie. I didn't know who would answer, but I needed to try. I pressed the button, whispering desperately, "If anyone's there, please, I'm in the research wing. There are things in here. I don't know what they are, but they're coming to life." Silence. Then, the faint crackle of static, followed by that same voice. "Get out of the research wing. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I opened the door just enough to slip out, careful not to draw attention to myself, and slipped back into the hallway. The humming grew louder behind me, and I could hear glass shattering as I sprinted down the corridor, not daring to look back. I'd barely made it a few yards before I heard it, a guttural scream, raw and inhuman, echoing through the halls. It was followed by more screams, a chorus of agony that sent waves of terror through my entire body. Whatever had been in those containers was awake, and it was angry. I ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors, my flashlight casting frantic beams as I searched for an exit. The screams grew louder, closer, until I could hear them right behind me, the sound of something scraping and pounding against the walls. Just as I thought I was done for, I spotted a stairwell at the end of the hall. I threw myself toward it, yanking the door open and stumbling down the stairs. I could hear the creatures above, their footsteps pounding in sync with my heartbeat, their guttural cries filling the stairwell. I reached the bottom and burst through another door, finding myself in a long, narrow corridor. It was different from the other halls, darker, colder, with walls lined in something that looked like metal. I had no idea where I was, but I didn't care. I just needed to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was up there. I sprinted down the corridor, the screams fading behind me, until I reached another door. This one was marked "Emergency Exit." With a surge of relief, I pushed it open and stepped outside, into the cold night air. The facility loomed behind me, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Whatever was in there, whatever horrors that place held, they were real. I stood there, catching my breath, staring back at the facility. And then, just as I was about to turn and leave, the walkie-talkie crackled one last time. "They're out." The cold night air hit me like a slap, jolting me from the nightmare I'd just escaped. But I didn't feel any relief. Those 3 words, "they're out," buzzed through my mind like a warning I couldn't ignore. I stood there, staring at the dark building, the silence pressing in around me. Part of me wanted to believe I was safe, that whatever those things were, they'd stay locked up in that twisted place. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I took a few shaky steps, trying to steady my breathing, but a flicker of movement in the trees caught my eye. I stopped, focusing on the darkness beyond the fence. There was something out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the facility lights. I could barely make it out, just a shape, tall and thin, moving through the trees with an unnatural, almost robotic grace. A chill ran through me as more figures appeared, weaving silently through the forest, heading in different directions. They weren't just wandering aimlessly. They had a purpose, and I knew that purpose was anything but good. I fumbled with the walkie-talkie, pressing the button with a trembling hand. Whoever's on the other end, you need to shut this place down. Those things, they're outside. They're spreading. Static crackled. Then that same low, monotone voice responded, calm and emotionless. Containment measures have failed. Evacuate the premises. Evacuate? I hissed, my voice barely a whisper. You don't get it. They're out there. They're loose. Heading somewhere. You need to stop them. But the voice didn't respond. The line went dead, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the night. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They didn't care about containing these things. Not anymore. They let them loose, like a twisted experiment gone wrong. And now, it was my problem. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to move. Standing there in shock wasn't going to help anyone. I needed to find a way out of the forest, away from the facility, and back to, well, anywhere but here. But as I took another step, I noticed something strange about the ground. It was covered in faint, almost invisible footprints, leading away from the facility and deeper into the woods. The prints were odd, each one elongated, as if the creatures had extra joints in their feet. The tracks were fresh, disturbing the fallen leaves and twigs, and they trailed off into the darkness. I tried to ignore them, pushing forward, but with every step, the sense of being watched grew stronger. A sudden rustling sounded to my left, and I swung the flashlight around, my pulse spiking. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows playing tricks on my mind. But then, from behind a tree, a figure emerged. It was one of them, its head cocked to the side, studying me with those hollow, empty sockets. I froze, trying not to breathe. It didn't move, just stood there, like it was waiting. Then slowly, it raised one bony hand, pointing in the direction of the footprints, as if urging me to follow. A shudder ran through me, and I took a step back, shaking my head. There was no way I was following it. But the creature just continued to point, unwavering, its face a blank, emotionless mask. I felt a sick sense of inevitability creeping over me, like it was telling me that I had no choice. Against every instinct, I turned and started walking in the direction it had pointed. The creature didn't follow. It just watched as I moved deeper into the woods, its gaze like a weight, pressing down on me until I was out of sight. The forest felt alive with the sounds of things moving through the trees, distant whispers, the crunch of leaves underfoot. Shadows shifted in the corners of my vision, slipping behind trees just as I turned to look. Every step felt heavier, like I was wading through a nightmare that refused to let me go. Then up ahead, I saw it, a clearing bathed in the pale light of the moon. In the center stood a strange structure, tall and angular, made of some kind of dark, metallic material. It looked out of place, like it had been dropped here from another world. I hesitated, but something compelled me forward. As I stepped into the clearing, I noticed the air felt colder, thick, with a strange metallic smell. The structure hummed softly, vibrating just enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I circled it slowly, trying to make sense of it. There were markings etched into its surface, symbols similar to the ones I'd seen scratched into the walls of the facility. Circles within circles, intersecting lines, strange geometric patterns that seemed to twist and shift when I looked at them directly. My fingers traced the patterns, and an intense, overwhelming sensation of dread washed over me. Whatever this thing was, it didn't belong here. It felt ancient, like it had been here long before any of us, waiting to be found. Suddenly, the humming grew louder, almost like it was responding to my touch. I pulled my hand back, heart racing, and stumbled away from the structure. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I heard a low, guttural moan coming from somewhere deep within the earth. Then, I saw them. Figures emerging from the trees, moving in perfect, unnatural synchronization. Dozens of them surrounding the clearing, closing in on all sides. Their hollow eyes were fixed on me, their movements slow and deliberate. I took a step back, my mind racing, and my heel hit something hard. I looked down to see a small metal hatch, half buried in the dirt. It looked like an access point, something that led underground. Without thinking, I dropped to my knees and yanked it open, revealing a narrow ladder descending into darkness. The creatures were getting closer, their footsteps growing louder, the air thick with their awful metallic stench. I didn't have a choice. I climbed down the ladder, slamming the hatch shut above me, just as I heard the first of them reach the clearing. The silence was immediate, pressing in around me like a thick blanket. I turned on my flashlight, casting a faint beam down a narrow tunnel lined with concrete walls. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, dust coating every surface. I crept down the tunnel, trying to ignore the suffocating darkness pressing in around me. Every so often, I'd hear faint scratching sounds coming from the walls, like something was trying to claw its way through from the other side. But I forced myself to keep moving, focusing on putting as much distance between myself and those things as possible. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading me deeper underground. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls, making it feel like I wasn't alone. And then, as I rounded a corner, I saw it. A massive metal door at the end of the tunnel, marked with the same symbols as the structure above. I approached cautiously, my hand shaking, as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit chamber filled with rows of monitors and control panels, each one humming with a faint, unnatural glow. The screens were all blank, except for one in the center, displaying a live feed of the clearing above. The creatures were gone. The clearing was empty, silent, like nothing had happened. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process everything I'd just seen. But then, the feed flickered, and a new image appeared. It was a view of the tunnel, the one I'd just come through. And standing at the far end, barely visible in the shadows, was a single figure, staring directly into the camera. Its face was still, emotionless, but its eyes seemed to pierce through the screen, like it was watching me. Then slowly, it raised one hand and pointed, right at me. I stumbled back, my mind racing with panic, and the screen went dark. The humming grew louder, filling the chamber with a sickening, oppressive vibration. I had to get out of there, but every instinct told me that there was nowhere left to run. And then, from the darkness, that same voice came through the speakers, calm and detached. They were never meant to leave. The words echoed through the chamber, each syllable pressing down on me like a weight. They were never meant to leave. My pulse thundered in my ears as the hum of the machines grew louder, vibrating through the metal floor and up into my bones. I glanced back at the monitor, but the screen was dark, leaving me alone in the dim, unsettling glow of the control panels. The air felt thick, suffused with the strange, metallic tang I'd noticed in the woods. I took a step back, trying to steady myself, but my legs felt weak, like they might give out at any second. Then, without warning, one of the monitors blinked back to life, showing a new camera angle, a view of the facility's entrance, the gate I'd come through hours before. And standing there in the shadows beyond the gate were dozens of figures. Their hollow eyes stared forward, unblinking, waiting, as if for a signal. My breath hitched. They weren't just in the forest anymore. They were gathering. The screen flickered again, and now it showed the corridors inside the facility, the same twisting, dimly lit hallways I'd stumbled through earlier. But the figures were inside now, moving in eerie unison, making their way deeper into the building. I could see them through the camera feeds, emerging from every doorway, every corner, filling the halls like a silent, relentless tide. And all of them were headed towards this chamber. I spun around, searching for another exit, but there was only the door I'd come through, the one that led back into the tunnel. The control panels around me hummed louder, filling the air with an electric charge, and the screens continued to flicker, each one cycling through different feeds, showing the figures drawing closer and closer. I didn't have much time. Frantic, I started pressing buttons on the control panels, hoping for anything, an alarm, a lockdown, some way to keep them out. But the system was ancient, and none of the commands seemed to respond. The monitors continued to flash, and with each new image, the creatures were closer, filling the halls like a silent, endless wave. My eyes landed on a small lever near the bottom of one of the panels, covered in a layer of dust. There was no label, but I didn't have the luxury of thinking it over. I reached down and pulled it, feeling the mechanism click into place. The humming stopped. The entire chamber went silent, and for a moment, all I could hear was the faint, irregular beat of my own heart. Then, one by one, the screens lit up again, but this time, they were different. They weren't showing the facility anymore. Instead, each screen displayed rows of data, strange symbols and numbers, scrolling past at an impossible speed, flickering and glitching. The room filled with a low, rhythmic pulsing sound, like a heartbeat, and I realized it wasn't coming from the machines. It was coming from somewhere beneath the floor. I backed away, staring in horror as the symbols continued to flash across the screens, faster and faster. It was like the facility itself was waking up, something deep inside it, stirring to life. The low pulse grew louder, and I could feel it resonating through the walls, a deep, unsettling rhythm that seemed to follow the beat of my own heart. Then, in one horrifying, deafening instant, the pulse stopped, and the floor beneath me began to shift. The metal panels split apart, revealing a dark, gaping hole at the center of the chamber. From its depths, a faint, greenish glow emerged, casting twisted shadows across the walls. I stumbled back, unable to look away, as something began to rise from the darkness. It was alive. A mass of shifting, writhing forms, limbs that twisted and fused in ways that defied logic. Eyes, hundreds of them, blinked and swiveled in every direction, focusing and unfocusing as if they were trying to make sense of the world. The creature, or whatever it was, let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the air, filling my head with a sense of overwhelming dread. The control panels flickered again, and that same voice, detached and calm, filled the room. Protocol breached. initiating purge. Purge. My mind raced as the word echoed in my head. The creature, the figures in the hallway, it all started to make sense, a sickening realization settling in. The facility wasn't just a lab or a containment center. It was a trap, a holding cell for things that should never see the light of day. And now that the containment had failed, the purge was the final, brutal solution. I had to get out of there, but the tunnel was already filling with those things. I could hear their footsteps, that horrible dragging shuffle as they drew closer. The creature in the pit below shifted, letting out another guttural moan as it pulled itself up, its many eyes now fixed on me. Desperate, I backed up against the wall, my mind racing for a way out. That's when I saw it. A small ventilation shaft in the corner, barely big enough to crawl through. I didn't hesitate. I dropped to the floor, pried the metal grate off, and squeezed inside, the sharp edges scraping against my arms and legs as I wriggled forward. The shaft was cramped, every movement slow and painful, but I forced myself forward, ignoring the sounds of the chaos erupting behind me. I could hear the creatures flooding into the chamber, their hollow footsteps and guttural moans filling the room. And then, a piercing, inhuman scream, a sound so raw and agonizing that it cut through me like a blade. I pushed myself further, crawling as fast as I could until I reached another grate. I kicked it out, dropping down into a narrow hallway I hadn't seen before. The lights were flickering, casting strange shadows along the walls, but I didn't stop to question it. I just ran, the cold air stinging my lungs as I sprinted through the twisting corridors, praying I'd find a way out. Behind me, the sound of pursuit grew louder. I didn't dare look back. I kept running, my legs burning, my vision blurred with exhaustion. And then, just as I was about to give up, I saw it. A door marked exit. With a final burst of energy, I slammed into the door, shoving it open and stumbling outside. The night air hit me like a wave, cold and sharp, and I staggered forward, gasping for breath. I was free. But as I looked around, my relief turned to horror. The clearing was gone. The trees, the sky, the stars, everything was gone. Instead, I was standing in an empty void, a vast, endless blackness stretching out in every direction. The facility was nowhere to be seen, as if it had vanished the moment I'd left. And then, in the distance, I saw them, the figures, marching silently through the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They were everywhere, surrounding me, moving closer with every step. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. As they closed in, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a numbness that dulled the terror I should have felt. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes as their cold, skeletal hands reached for me, pulling me into the dark. The last thing I heard was that same voice, echoing in the emptiness, calm and detached, as if reciting a line from some forgotten script. Containment restored.